Deep in the shadow of the Montana wilderness, 9-year-old Ethan made a choice no child should have to make. His parents were gone. The state wanted to take his German shepherd, Rex, away, and foster care loomed like a prison. So he ran. Hidden beneath ancient stone, he found a cave, dark and forgotten, with only his loyal dog by his side. Most children would see nothing but cold rock and fear, but Ethan saw salvation. With scraps he salvaged and determination that defied his age, he began to transform the bare cave into something extraordinary. Rex stood guard as his small hands worked day after day, building a hidden paradise from nothing. But the cave held more than shelter. One morning, Rex began scratching frantically at a section of the stone wall, whining with desperate urgency. What had the dog discovered that a 9-year-old boy could not see? What secret was buried deep within the mountain? The morning sun felt like a betrayal, too bright and cheerful for a day that had shattered Ethan's world into pieces too small to ever fit back together. He sat on the worn couch in the living room of the small house that no longer felt like home. His hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his 9-year-old mind struggling to process words that adults kept saying to him in soft, careful voices that made everything worse. His parents were gone. The police officer had used the phrase, "didn't survive the impact," and Ethan had nodded because that's what people expected, but the words meant nothing. Were just sounds that couldn't possibly describe the fact that his mother would never make pancakes again, that his father would never take him hiking on the mountain trails they both loved. Rex, his German shepherd, lay at his feet, the dog's large head resting on Ethan's sneakers, brown eyes watching him with an intelligence that seemed to understand more than any of the adults in the room. The social worker, a woman named Miss Patterson with kind eyes and a clipboard that she held like a shield, sat across from him in his father's favorite chair, and that felt wrong too, like an invasion. She had been talking for what seemed like hours, explaining foster care, temporary placement, how they would find him a good family, all words that washed over Ethan like cold water. Then she said the thing that made his heart stop. "Ethan, sweetheart, I know this is hard, but we need to talk about Rex." She glanced at the dog, and Ethan felt his stomach twist. "The foster home we've arranged, they're wonderful people, but they can't take a dog, especially not one as large as Rex. We'll need to contact Animal Services, find him a good shelter, maybe a new home." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Rex wasn't just a dog, he was family, the only family Ethan had left. His father had brought Rex home as a puppy 3 years ago, and the dog had been Ethan's constant companion, his protector, his best friend. The thought of losing Rex too, of being completely alone, was more than he could bear. "No," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "Miss." Patterson leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "I know you love him, but right now we need to focus on getting you settled. Once you're in a stable situation, maybe in a few months, we can talk about possibilities." "No," Ethan said again, louder this time. Rex lifted his head, sensing the distress in his young master's voice. Miss Patterson's phone rang, and she glanced at it with a frown. "I'm sorry, I need to take this. It's about your placement." She stood and walked into the kitchen, her voice dropping to a professional murmur. Ethan sat frozen for 3 heartbeats, his mind racing. He looked at Rex, at the dog's trusting eyes, and then at the front door where Miss Patterson's car was parked, at the back door that led to the woods his father had taught him to navigate. He thought about foster homes and shelters and being separated from the only living thing he loved. The decision formed in an instant, born of desperation and grief and a certainty that adults didn't understand what mattered. Moving quickly and quietly, Ethan grabbed his school backpack from beside the couch and ran to his room. He stuffed it with clothes, his father's old compass, a flashlight, the pocket knife his dad had given him for his last birthday, and a framed photo of his family. He took the emergency cash his mother kept in the kitchen drawer, $63 that felt like stealing but also like survival. Rex followed him, alert now, tail wagging slightly as if sensing an adventure. From the kitchen, Miss Patterson's voice continued, discussing paperwork and timing. Ethan's hand touched the back door handle, and he paused for just a moment, knowing that what he was about to do would change everything, that there would be no going back. Then he heard Miss Patterson say Animal Control could come tomorrow morning, and the choice was made. He turned the handle, whispered, "Come on, Rex," and together they slipped out into the morning air, leaving behind the only home Ethan had ever known. The forest swallowed them whole within minutes. the thick Montana pines closing around Ethan and Rex like protective arms, shutting out the world they were leaving behind. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as they pushed deeper into the wilderness, his legs pumping hard, driven by a fear that someone would discover his absence and come searching before he could get far enough away. Rex ran beside him, powerful and sure-footed, his German Shepherd instincts alert to every sound and scent in the dense woods. They followed the old trails Ethan's father had shown him during their weekend camping trips, paths that wound up into the higher elevations where few people ventured, where the air grew thin and cold and the world became wild. His father's voice echoed in his memory, patient and steady, teaching him how to read the forest, how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to locate water by listening for the sound of running streams, how to move quietly and leave minimal trace. Those lessons, taught during happy times when survival was just a game, now became the only tools Ethan had to keep himself and Rex alive. They hiked for hours, the afternoon sun sliding across the sky as they climbed higher into the mountains. Ethan's backpack grew heavy on his small shoulders, the straps digging in, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop, not until he was certain they were beyond reach. Rex never complained, never slowed, his loyalty absolute, his trust in his young master unshakable. They crossed rocky ridges where the pine trees gave way to granite outcroppings, followed game trails that twisted through dense undergrowth, and forded a narrow creek where Ethan paused just long enough to refill his water bottle and let Rex drink his fill. The cold mountain water tasted pure and clean, nothing like the filtered tap water from home, and Ethan felt a strange sense of freedom mixed with his terror, a realization that he was truly on his own now, accountable to no one, dependent on nothing but his own skills and Rex's companionship. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ethan felt the temperature drop sharply. His father had warned him about mountain nights, how the cold could kill an unprepared traveler, how hypothermia could set in faster than most people realized. He needed shelter, and he needed it soon. They moved with increased urgency now, Ethan's eyes scanning the landscape for anything that might offer protection from the coming night. He spotted several possibilities: a dense thicket of pine branches, a fallen log that created a small hollow underneath, an overhang of rock that provided minimal coverage. None of them felt right. None of them felt safe enough, secure enough for what he knew would be many nights ahead. Rex suddenly stopped, his ears perking forward, his nose working the air. The dog moved off the trail, pushing through a tangle of brush and low-hanging branches, and Ethan followed, trusting the animal's instincts. They emerged into a small clearing where the mountain rose steeply, its face a wall of gray stone and ancient rock. There, partially hidden by overgrown brush and a tumble of fallen boulders, Ethan saw a dark opening in the mountain itself, a cave. Rex approached it cautiously, sniffing at the entrance, then looked back at Ethan as if seeking approval. The boy moved forward slowly, pulling out his flashlight with trembling hands. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing a space that extended back into the mountain, mysterious and unknown. This could be their salvation or their tomb, but night was falling fast, and Ethan was out of options. He looked at Rex, took a deep breath, and together they stepped into the darkness. The cave mouth yawned before them like the entrance to another world, dark and silent and smelling of damp earth and ancient stone. Ethan stood at the threshold, his flashlight beam cutting through the blackness, revealing rough walls that glistened with moisture and a floor covered in centuries of accumulated dirt and small rocks. Rex moved ahead, his nose to the ground, his body language cautious but not afraid, and Ethan took that as a good sign. His father had taught him that dogs could sense danger better than humans, that they could smell things people couldn't, and if Rex wasn't running away, then whatever lay inside was probably safe. Ethan stepped through the entrance, his sneakers crunching on loose gravel, and the temperature dropped immediately, the air inside noticeably cooler than the mountain evening outside. The entrance chamber was larger than he had expected, roughly circular, with a ceiling that rose about 8 feet above his head. Stalactites hung like frozen tears from the rocky ceiling, and the walls showed the work of water over countless years, smooth in some places, jagged in others. He swept his flashlight in a slow arc, taking in every detail, and that's when he noticed the second opening. At the far end of the chamber, partially obscured by a natural column of stone, another passage led deeper into the mountain. Rex had already found it and stood waiting, looking back at Ethan with patient eyes that seemed to say they should explore further. Ethan's heart raced with a mixture of fear and excitement as he followed the dog into the second chamber. This space was smaller, more intimate, with a lower ceiling that made Ethan feel enclosed but also protected, like being wrapped in a stone blanket. The air here was drier, which his father had told him was important, because dampness could make you sick if you lived in it too long. The floor was relatively flat, covered in fine sand and dust that showed no recent footprints, except the ones Rex was making now. No animals had denned here recently, no bear or mountain lion, which meant it was available, unclaimed territory. Ethan discovered a third chamber beyond the second, this one the smallest of all, barely larger than a closet, but it had something the others didn't. A narrow crack in the ceiling allowed a thin shaft of fading daylight to penetrate the darkness, and directly below it, water had collected in a natural depression in the stone floor, forming a small pool no bigger than a cooking pot. Ethan knelt beside it, shining his light into the clear water, watching it reflect back at him. The water was still, undisturbed, fed by condensation and occasional rain that found its way through the crack above. It wasn't much, but it was something. A natural resource that could be crucial for survival. He returned to the main chamber and stood in the center, turning slowly, his mind already working on possibilities. The cave was perfect in ways he hadn't dared hope for. It was hidden from view, accessible but not obvious, large enough to live in but small enough to defend and keep warm. The multiple chambers meant he could organize his space, use one area for sleeping, another for storage, perhaps use the smallest for the water collection. Rex sat near the entrance, silhouetted against the last purple light of dusk, and Ethan walked over to join him. He looked out at the wilderness beyond, at the dark shapes of pine trees against the darkening sky, at the vast and empty landscape that was now his only home. Fear clutched at his chest, the reality of what he had done settling over him like the coming night, but he pushed it down, forced himself to be strong. He had Rex, he had shelter, and he had the skills his father had given him. This cave, hidden in the Montana mountains, would be their refuge, their fortress, their new beginning. Ethan reached down and scratched Rex behind the ears, feeling the dog's warmth and solid presence. They would make this work because they had no other choice. The darkness inside the cave was absolute, a blackness so complete it seemed to have weight and texture, pressing against Ethan's eyes even when they were open. He had turned off his flashlight an hour ago to conserve the batteries, knowing that light was a precious resource he couldn't afford to waste, and now he sat with his back against the cold stone wall of the main chamber, his thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, Rex pressed tight against his side. The dog's body heat was the only warmth in a space that seemed to leach away every degree of temperature, and Ethan found himself shivering despite the blanket, despite Rex's presence, despite his best efforts to stay calm and strong. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the cave entrance like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of pine and the promise of a long, cold night. Ethan's stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he had eaten very little since morning, just a granola bar and an apple from his backpack, carefully rationed because he didn't know when he would find more food or how long his meager supplies would need to last. The reality of his situation crashed over him in waves, each one harder than the last. He was 9 years old, alone in a cave in the Montana wilderness, with no adult to help him, no safety net, no backup plan. If he got sick, there was no doctor. If he got hurt, there was no hospital. If he failed to find food or water or warmth, there was no one to save him. He had left behind everything familiar, everything safe. And for what? To keep Rex? The thought made him reach out in the darkness, his small hand finding the dog's thick fur, gripping it like an anchor. Yes, he thought fiercely, to keep Rex, because Rex was all he had left, the only connection to his old life, to his parents, to love and family and home. Losing Rex would have been like losing them all over again, and Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice, even if it was also the hardest and scariest choice of his life. Rex shifted beside him, the dog's breathing deep and steady, a rhythmic sound that was somehow comforting in the oppressive silence of the cave. Ethan wondered what Rex was thinking, if dogs understood concepts like danger and survival, if Rex knew they were in trouble, or if he simply trusted that his young master had a plan. The truth was Ethan didn't have much of a plan beyond surviving until morning, beyond making it through this first terrible night and figuring out the next step when the sun rose again. His father's voice came to him again from memory, words spoken around a campfire on a trip that now seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. The most important thing in survival, Ethan, is mental toughness. Your body can endure a lot, but your mind has to be stronger. You have to decide to survive, make it a promise to yourself, and then do whatever it takes to keep that promise. Ethan closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute darkness, and he made that promise now. He promised himself that he would survive, that he would learn to live in this wilderness, that he would protect Rex and keep them both alive, no matter what it took. He promised his parents, wherever they were, that he wouldn't give up, wouldn't surrender, wouldn't let their deaths be the end of everything. He would honor the lessons his father had taught him by putting them into practice, by becoming the kind of person who could face impossible odds and still find a way forward. The night stretched ahead of him, long and cold and frightening, but Ethan held on to that promise like a lifeline. Rex pressed closer, as if sensing his young master's distress, offering the only comfort he could, and together they waited for dawn in the darkness of their stone sanctuary. Hours passed with excruciating slowness, measured only by the gradual shift of Ethan's thoughts from panic to determination, from fear to resolve. He dozed fitfully, his body exhausted but his mind too active for real sleep, and when he finally saw the first gray light of morning creeping through the cave entrance, he felt a profound relief wash over him. They had survived their first night, and that meant they could survive another. The morning light revealed a world that looked different from the terrified perspective of the previous night, softer somehow, less threatening, and Ethan emerged from the cave with Rex at his side, blinking against the brightness of a clear Montana sky. His first priority was water, and he followed the sound of running water that he had heard faintly during their approach the day before, Rex leading the way with confident strides down a gentle slope through thick underbrush. They found a narrow stream cascading over smooth rocks, the water crystal clear and cold enough to make Ethan's teeth ache when he cupped his hands and drank deeply. He refilled his water bottle, watching Rex lap at the stream with obvious enjoyment, and Ethan felt his first small victory. Water was life, his father had always said, and now they had a reliable source just a 10-minute walk from their cave. Over the following days, Ethan established a routine born of necessity and survival instinct. Each morning he would venture out with Rex to gather what they needed, always staying within a reasonable distance of the cave, always moving carefully to avoid leaving obvious trails that someone searching might follow. He collected fallen branches for firewood, choosing pieces that were dry and dead, avoiding green wood that would smoke too much and potentially give away their location. His arms ached from dragging the heavier logs back to the cave, and his hands developed blisters that eventually became calluses, physical proof of his transformation from suburban boy to wilderness survivor. He learned to identify the soft moss that grew on the north side of trees and rocks, gathering handfuls of it to create a bedding layer that would insulate him and Rex from the cold stone floor of the cave. The work was slow and tedious, requiring multiple trips to accumulate enough moss to make a difference, but Ethan found a strange satisfaction in the task, in the tangible progress he could see as the pile grew larger. He discovered edible plants that his father had pointed out during their camping trips, dandelion greens, wild onions, and pine nuts that required patience to extract from their cones but provided valuable calories. Rex proved invaluable during these expeditions, his senses far sharper than Ethan's limited human perception. The dog would suddenly freeze, ears forward, body tense, and Ethan learned to trust these warnings without question. Once, Rex's growl stopped Ethan from walking directly into a clearing where a black bear was foraging for berries, and they retreated silently, carefully, Ethan's heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Another time, Rex alerted him to the presence of a rattlesnake coiled beneath a rock Ethan had been about to move. The dog's bark sharp and insistent until Ethan saw the danger and backed away. These close calls taught Ethan that survival in the wilderness required constant vigilance, that a single mistake could mean death, and that Rex was more than a companion but a true partner whose instincts and abilities complemented his own. He began to notice other things too, patterns in the forest that his father had mentioned but that he was only now beginning to truly understand. The way certain birds called warnings when predators were near, the tracks in the soft earth that told stories of who had passed and when, the subtle changes in the wind that could signal approaching weather. Ethan collected other useful items during his foraging trips, long straight sticks that could serve multiple purposes, flat rocks suitable for building, strips of bark that could be woven into crude rope, and pine pitch that was sticky and waterproof. He cached some supplies near the stream, hidden beneath a fallen log, so he wouldn't always have to carry everything back to the cave in one trip. Each day brought new discoveries and new challenges, and Ethan found himself growing more confident, more capable, more adapted to this harsh new life. His body grew leaner and stronger, his senses sharper, his movements more efficient and purposeful. Rex remained his constant shadow and guardian, and together they began to transform the cave from a simple shelter into something that might, with time and effort, actually become a home. The transformation of the cave began with fire, the most fundamental need after water and shelter, and Ethan approached the task with a determination that surprised even himself. He selected stones from the stream bed, choosing flat pieces of granite and river rock that his father had once told him wouldn't crack or explode when heated, carrying them back to the cave one armful at a time until he had enough to build a proper fire pit. He positioned the pit carefully in the main chamber, close enough to the entrance that smoke would have a path to escape, but far enough inside that wind wouldn't extinguish the flames or make them dangerous. The rocks formed a circle about 3 feet across, stacked 2 layers high, creating a barrier that would contain the fire and reflect heat back into the living space. Building the fire itself was harder than Ethan had anticipated, his first attempts producing nothing but frustration and smoke that made his eyes water. He had watched his father do it dozens of times, had even helped gather kindling and arrange the wood, but doing it himself, alone, with hands that trembled from cold and hunger, was entirely different. He used his father's pocket knife to shave thin curls of wood from a dry stick, creating tinder that would catch easily, and arranged them in a small nest of dried grass and pine needles. His father's old lighter, found in a jacket pocket and transferred to Ethan's backpack almost by accident, provided the spark that his primitive fire-making skills could not. And Ethan felt a profound gratitude for this small piece of technology as the flames finally caught and grew. The fire changed everything, pushing back the darkness and cold, filling the cave with warmth and light and the comforting smell of burning pine. Rex lay near the fire pit, his eyes reflecting the flames, and for the first time since running away, Ethan felt something close to safe. With the fire established, he turned his attention to creating a proper sleeping area, knowing that his thin blanket and the moss he had gathered wouldn't be enough as the temperatures continued to drop. He ventured out to collect long, straight branches, choosing pieces about as thick as his wrist and roughly the same length, 6 feet or so. The work was exhausting for his small frame, and his hands, already rough from days of labor, developed new blisters that burst and bled, staining the wood he carried. He didn't stop, couldn't stop, driven by a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, some reserve of strength he hadn't known he possessed. Back in the cave, Ethan used rocks and the natural contours of the chamber's wall to create a raised platform, laying the branches side by side to form a sleeping surface elevated several inches off the cold stone floor. He lashed the branches together with strips of bark that he had soaked in water to make them pliable, his small fingers working carefully to create knots that would hold. The platform was crude, uneven in places, but it was functional, and when he tested it with his weight, it held firm. He covered the branches with layer upon layer of pine needles, creating a mattress that was surprisingly comfortable, soft and fragrant, providing insulation from below and cushioning from above. The moss went on top of the pine needles, adding another layer of warmth, and finally his blanket over everything. When he lay down on his creation that night, with Rex curled up beside the platform, Ethan felt a swell of pride that momentarily pushed aside his fear and loneliness. He had built this with his own hands, created something useful and necessary from nothing but materials the forest provided. His body ached in ways he had never experienced, his muscles screaming from unaccustomed labor, his hands throbbing from cuts and scrapes and blisters. But these were good pains, productive pains, the pains of someone who was actively surviving rather than passively waiting to be rescued. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the cave walls, and Ethan watched them until his eyes grew heavy. He had taken the first real steps toward making this cave livable, toward creating a space that could sustain him through the coming challenges, and as sleep finally claimed him, he felt something he hadn't felt since his parents died, a small but growing sense of accomplishment and purpose. The storm arrived on the 7th day with a violence that caught Ethan completely unprepared, but Rex knew it was coming hours before the first drops fell. The dog had been restless since morning, pacing near the cave entrance, whining softly, his ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds that Ethan's duller human hearing couldn't detect. Ethan had dismissed it as boredom or hunger, focused instead on his project of weaving a basket from willow branches he had found near the stream. But when Rex's agitation increased to outright distress, barking sharply and pawing at Ethan's leg, the boy finally paid attention. He stepped outside and looked at the sky, seeing dark clouds massing over the western peaks, moving fast, their bellies heavy and threatening. His father had taught him to read weather signs, and these were unmistakable portents of serious trouble. The wind picked up suddenly, cold and fierce, bending the pine trees and sending loose needles swirling through the air. Ethan had perhaps 30 minutes, maybe less, before the storm hit with full force. He rushed to move his firewood deeper into the cave, stacking it in the driest corner of the second chamber, and secured his few possessions in his backpack, hanging it from a rock protrusion well above floor level. Rex stayed close, his anxiety feeding Ethan's own growing fear. When the rain finally came, it came like a wall of water, sheets of it driven horizontal by howling wind. Thunder cracked so loud it seemed to shake the mountain itself, and lightning turned the world outside into stuttering flashes of white and black. Ethan huddled in the back of the cave with Rex, watching in horror as water began to pour through the entrance, not just falling from above but flowing across the ground like a river finding its course. Within minutes, the entire entrance chamber was flooding, water spreading across the stone floor, seeking the lowest points, and to Ethan's dismay, the lowest point was exactly where his sleeping platform sat. He watched helplessly as the water reached his carefully constructed bed, soaking into the pine needles and moss, destroying hours of work in seconds. But wallowing in despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. Ethan grabbed a flat piece of wood he had been planning to use for something else and began frantically digging a channel in the loose dirt near the cave entrance, trying to redirect the water flow away from his living space. His hands were numb from the cold water, his clothes soaked through, but he kept working, scraping and scooping, creating a crude trench that would guide the water toward the side of the cave and out through a lower opening he discovered during his excavation. Rex helped by instinct, digging with his powerful paws beside Ethan, the two of them working in desperate tandem. Slowly, painfully, the drainage channel began to work, the water following the path they had created, flowing away from the main chamber. The storm lasted 3 hours, an eternity of pounding rain and violent wind, and when it finally passed, Ethan collapsed on the wet stone floor, exhausted beyond measure. His sleeping platform was ruined, his body shaking from cold and exertion. But he had learned something crucial that his father's camping trips had never taught him, because controlled lessons could never replicate real crisis. He had learned that survival meant constant adaptation, that nature would test him again and again, and that Rex's instincts were a gift he must never ignore. Hunger became Ethan's constant companion by the end of the second week, a gnawing emptiness in his belly that made his hands shake and his thoughts slow and cloudy. The granola bars and crackers he had taken from home were long gone, eaten sparingly but inevitably depleted, and Ethan faced the reality that he would have to find food from the land itself, or starve. His father had taught him basic trapping during their camping trips, simple snares made from wire or strong cord that could catch small game if placed correctly along animal trails, and Ethan set about constructing these traps with materials he scavenged from his surroundings. He used thin branches bent into loops, weighted with rocks, triggered by a delicate balance that would spring closed when an animal pushed through. He placed 3 traps along paths where he had seen rabbit droppings and tracks in the soft earth, positioning them with care, trying to remember every detail his father had demonstrated. The first 2 days brought nothing but disappointment, empty traps that mocked his efforts, and Ethan felt despair creeping in, the fear that he would fail at this most basic requirement of survival. He supplemented his meager diet with foraged plants, things his father had pointed out as edible during their woodland walks. He found wild strawberries, tiny and intensely sweet, that grew in a sunny patch on the south-facing slope below the cave. He gathered dandelion greens, bitter and tough, that he ate raw because he didn't know how to cook them properly. He discovered cattails growing near the stream, pulling up the roots and eating them despite their muddy taste and stringy texture. Each plant brought minimal calories, barely enough to keep him functional, and Ethan understood with growing clarity that he needed protein, needed meat, or his body would begin to consume itself. Rex seemed to sense his young master's desperation, and on the 3rd day of trapping, the dog did something remarkable. They were checking the snares together, Ethan's hope fading as he found the first 2 empty once again, when Rex suddenly bolted into the underbrush, moving with speed and purpose that left Ethan scrambling to follow. He heard barking, then a high-pitched squeal, and when he pushed through the dense vegetation, he found Rex standing over a rabbit, freshly killed, his hunting instincts having succeeded where Ethan's primitive traps had failed. The dog looked at Ethan, then at the rabbit, and made no move to eat it himself, an offering from companion to companion. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude and relief, and the simple generosity of this animal who could have eaten the entire rabbit himself but chose to share. Using his pocket knife, Ethan cleaned the rabbit the way his father had shown him once, the process messy and difficult with hands that trembled from hunger and inexperience. But eventually he had meat, real meat, that could sustain them both. He built up the fire in the cave until the flames burned hot and steady, then fashioned a crude spit from green branches and cooked the rabbit slowly, turning it constantly, the smell of roasting meat so intoxicating it made his mouth water and his stomach cramp with anticipation. When it was finally done, the outside charred in places and raw in others because Ethan's cooking skills were as primitive as everything else in his new life. He pulled off pieces and shared them with Rex, the two of them eating in companionable silence. The meat was tough and gamey, nothing like the chicken and beef his mother used to prepare, but it was the most delicious thing Ethan had ever tasted because it represented survival, proof that he could feed himself and Rex, that they could actually live out here despite the odds stacked against them. That night, with his belly fuller than it had been in days, Ethan lay on his rebuilt sleeping platform and thought about gratitude, about how he had taken food for granted his entire life, never thinking about where it came from or what it cost. Now every meal was a victory, every calorie earned through effort and skill and sometimes luck, and he understood that this was what real survival meant. Not the romantic adventure he had sometimes imagined during camping trips, but a daily struggle where success was measured in the smallest increments, a rabbit shared between a boy and his dog. Hunger became Ethan's constant companion by the end of the second week, a gnawing emptiness in his belly that made his hands shake and his thoughts slow and cloudy. The granola bars and crackers he had taken from home were long gone, eaten sparingly but inevitably depleted, and Ethan faced the reality that he would have to find food from the land itself, or starve. His father had taught him basic trapping during their camping trips, simple snares made from wire or strong cord that could catch small game if placed correctly along animal trails, and Ethan set about constructing these traps with materials he scavenged from his surroundings. He used thin branches bent into loops, weighted with rocks, triggered by a delicate balance that would spring closed when an animal pushed through. He placed 3 traps along paths where he had seen rabbit droppings and tracks in the soft earth, positioning them with care, trying to remember every detail his father had demonstrated. The first 2 days brought nothing but disappointment, empty traps that mocked his efforts, and Ethan felt despair creeping in, the fear that he would fail at this most basic requirement of survival. He supplemented his meager diet with foraged plants, things his father had pointed out as edible during their woodland walks. He found wild strawberries, tiny and intensely sweet, that grew in a sunny patch on the south-facing slope below the cave. He gathered dandelion greens, bitter and tough, that he ate raw because he didn't know how to cook them properly. He discovered cattails growing near the stream, pulling up the roots and eating them despite their muddy taste and stringy texture. Each plant brought minimal calories, barely enough to keep him functional, and Ethan understood with growing clarity that he needed protein, needed meat, or his body would begin to consume itself. Rex seemed to sense his young master's desperation, and on the 3rd day of trapping, the dog did something remarkable. They were checking the snares together, Ethan's hope fading as he found the first 2 empty once again, when Rex suddenly bolted into the underbrush, moving with speed and purpose that left Ethan scrambling to follow. He heard barking, then a high-pitched squeal, and when he pushed through the dense vegetation, he found Rex standing over a rabbit, freshly killed, his hunting instincts having succeeded where Ethan's primitive traps had failed. The dog looked at Ethan, then at the rabbit, and made no move to eat it himself, an offering from companion to companion. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude and relief, and the simple generosity of this animal, who could have eaten the entire rabbit himself, but chose to share. Using his pocket knife, Ethan cleaned the rabbit the way his father had shown him once, the process messy and difficult with hands that trembled from hunger and inexperience. But eventually he had meat, real meat, that could sustain them both. He built up the fire in the cave until the flames burned hot and steady, then fashioned a crude spit from green branches and cooked the rabbit slowly, turning it constantly. The smell of roasting meat so intoxicating it made his mouth water and his stomach cramp with anticipation. When it was finally done, the outside charred in places and raw in others because Ethan's cooking skills were as primitive as everything else in his new life. He pulled off pieces and shared them with Rex, the two of them eating in companionable silence. The meat was tough and gamey, nothing like the chicken and beef his mother used to prepare. But it was the most delicious thing Ethan had ever tasted because it represented survival, proof that he could feed himself and Rex, that they could actually live out here despite the odds stacked against them. That night, with his belly fuller than it had been in days, Ethan lay on his rebuilt sleeping platform and thought about gratitude, about how he had taken food for granted his entire life, never thinking about where it came from or what it cost. Now every meal was a victory, every calorie earned through effort and skill and sometimes luck, and he understood that this was what real survival meant. Not the romantic adventure he had sometimes imagined during camping trips, but a daily struggle where success was measured in the smallest increments, a rabbit shared between a boy and his dog. With hunger no longer his most immediate threat, Ethan turned his attention to making the cave more than just a place to sleep and hide, transforming it into something that felt less like a desperate refuge and more like an actual home. The wind that whistled through the entrance at night had become more than an annoyance. It threatened to extinguish his fire, scattered his carefully organized supplies, and created drafts that made sleeping difficult even with Rex's warmth beside him. Ethan decided to build a door, a barrier that could block the wind while still allowing smoke to escape and giving him a way to monitor the world outside. He gathered long, flexible willow branches from near the stream, the same material he had experimented with for his basket, and spent 2 entire days weaving them together in a lattice pattern, over and under, creating a frame that was surprisingly sturdy despite his small hands and limited experience. He reinforced the weaving with strips of bark that he soaked until they were pliable, wrapping them around the junction points to add strength, and then filled the gaps between branches with bundles of dried grass and small twigs, creating a panel that would block wind while remaining light enough for him to move when necessary. The finished door wasn't beautiful by any measure, crude and uneven, but when Ethan propped it against the cave entrance using rocks as anchors and wedges, it worked, dramatically reducing the wind that had plagued him and creating a psychological barrier that made the cave feel more secure, more private, more his. He created a storage system next, using natural shelves formed by rock outcroppings in the second chamber, and supplementing them with platforms he built from flat stones, stacked carefully to create stable surfaces. He organized his possessions with a precision that would have surprised his mother, who had constantly nagged him about his messy bedroom in their old house. His father's compass went on the highest shelf, protected from moisture and easily accessible if he needed to navigate. His pocket knife stayed in his pocket always, too valuable to risk losing. The remaining emergency cash, now $47 after he had used some to buy supplies on his last trip to civilization, he wrapped in plastic from a discarded water bottle he had found and tucked into a crack in the wall. Food storage became a priority, as Ethan's foraging and trapping became more successful. He wove additional baskets from willow and grass, creating containers of different sizes for different purposes, one for dried berries and nuts, another for roots and tubers, a third for strips of dried meat that he learned to preserve by hanging them near the fire until they became hard and leathery. He discovered that certain plants, when dried, made his stored food last longer by keeping insects away, and he lined his baskets with these aromatic leaves, creating a primitive but effective preservation system. Rex had his own area now, a spot near the fire pit that Ethan covered with the softest moss and pine needles, creating a bed for the dog that showed how much he valued his companion's comfort and loyalty. Ethan carved small improvements into the cave walls, using sharp rocks, creating hooks from pieces of bone he found and secured with pine pitch, places to hang his wet clothes and his backpack, and the various tools he crafted from wood and stone. He built a reflector wall behind the fire pit using flat stones stacked at an angle, directing more heat into the living area and making his limited firewood more efficient. Each addition, each improvement, no matter how small, represented progress, a step away from mere survival towards something approaching sustainable living. The cave began to feel different, the cold stone walls less hostile, the darkness less oppressive. Ethan spent hours arranging and rearranging his space, finding the optimal position for each item, creating pathways that made moving between chambers easier, designating specific areas for specific activities. Sleeping here, cooking there, working in this corner, storing supplies in that one. He even created a small area near the entrance where he could sit and look out at the forest, a place for thinking and planning and simply being still. Rex would often join him there, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence, boy and dog, watching the world beyond their hidden sanctuary. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The cave stopped being the place where Ethan was hiding and became the place where he was living, a subtle but profound shift in perspective that gave him strength and hope he hadn't felt since his parents died. The voices came without warning on a bright afternoon when Ethan was outside the cave organizing his firewood, and the sound of human speech after weeks of hearing nothing but wind and birdsong, and Rex's occasional bark froze him in place like a deer sensing a predator. Two voices, a man and a woman, talking and laughing, growing steadily louder as they approached along a trail that passed within 50 yards of the cave entrance. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized his mistake, his terrible and potentially fatal mistake. The door he had woven was propped against the cave entrance in plain view, an obvious sign of human habitation, and worse, thin smoke from his morning fire was still drifting lazily from the opening, a signal visible from a considerable distance. He whistled softly for Rex, the sound they had developed for emergencies, and the dog appeared instantly from wherever he had been exploring, sensing the urgency in his master's tone. Together they slipped into the cave, Ethan's hands shaking as he pulled the woven door closed behind them as quietly as possible, praying the hikers hadn't already seen it or the smoke or any of the other dozen signs he had carelessly left scattered around his hidden home. They retreated to the deepest chamber, the small room with the water collection pool, and Ethan pressed himself against the cold stone wall, one hand on Rex's collar to keep the dog still and silent, barely daring to breathe as the voices grew closer and closer. He could hear them clearly now, a middle-aged couple discussing trail conditions and lunch plans, their footsteps crunching on pine needles and loose rock, normal people doing normal things, completely unaware that a runaway boy and his dog were hiding in terror just yards away. Rex remained perfectly still, his training and natural discipline overriding any instinct to bark or investigate. But Ethan could feel the tension in the dog's body, the coiled readiness to protect if protection became necessary. The hikers stopped, and Ethan's blood turned to ice. "Do you smell smoke?" the woman asked, her voice curious rather than alarmed. There was a pause, and Ethan could imagine them looking around, scanning the area, perhaps noticing things he had foolishly failed to conceal. Maybe a campfire from another group. The man replied, "Or maybe old smoke from a lightning strike. These mountains get hit all the time." Another pause, longer this time, and Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, silently begging them to move on, to lose interest, to convince themselves there was nothing worth investigating. "Should we check?" the woman asked, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped. "Nah," the man said finally, blessed words that Ethan would remember forever. "We're losing daylight and we still have 3 miles to the ridge. Come on." The voices receded gradually, the footsteps growing fainter, and still Ethan remained frozen against the cave wall, counting slowly to 1,000 before he dared to move, before he trusted that they were truly gone. When he finally crept back to the entrance and peered out through a gap in his woven door, the forest was empty and silent. The hikers vanished as if they had never existed. The close call shook Ethan to his core, shattering the comfortable illusion of safety he had been building along with his physical improvements to the cave. He realized with horrifying clarity how vulnerable he was, how easily his carefully constructed sanctuary could be discovered, how one careless mistake could lead to his capture and separation from Rex, the very outcome he had risked everything to avoid. He spent the rest of that day and all of the next systematically eliminating evidence of his presence. He scattered the organized piles of firewood to make them look like natural deadfall. He dismantled the reflector wall behind his fire pit because the stones were too obviously arranged. He made sure his door could be quickly removed and hidden if necessary, practicing the motion until he could do it in seconds. He established rules for himself, protocols that he would follow religiously, only small fires, and only when weather conditions meant the smoke would disperse quickly. Never leave the cave entrance area looking disturbed or organized. Always check for approaching sounds before venturing outside. Create multiple escape routes in case the main entrance became compromised. He even began covering his tracks when he walked to and from the stream, using a pine branch to sweep away footprints, taking different routes each time to avoid creating an obvious path. Rex seemed to understand the new caution, moving more quietly, staying closer to Ethan during their outside ventures, his ears constantly alert for sounds of approaching danger. That night, lying on his sleeping platform while Rex kept watch near the entrance, Ethan understood a fundamental truth about his new life. He wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, he was hiding. And hiding required constant vigilance, unending caution, and the acceptance that discovery was always one mistake away. The first yellow leaves appeared on the aspens in mid-September, a warning written in gold that Ethan understood with growing dread. Winter was coming, and he was nowhere near ready. His father had told him stories about Montana winters, about temperatures that could drop to 20 below zero, about snowfalls measured in feet rather than inches, about people who died from exposure within hours of being caught unprepared. Ethan had perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 8 if he was lucky, to transform his cave from a 3-season shelter into a fortress capable of withstanding the brutal cold that would soon descend from the high peaks. The work consumed him completely, every waking hour dedicated to preparation with an intensity born of pure survival instinct. Firewood became his obsession, and he gathered it with a determination that bordered on manic. He ventured farther from the cave than he had dared since the close call with the hikers, dragging back dead branches and fallen logs, breaking them into manageable pieces using rocks and his small folding saw, stacking them in the deepest, driest part of the second chamber where moisture wouldn't rot them. He estimated he would need a fire burning constantly for 4 months, maybe 5, and the amount of wood required was staggering. His hands developed thick calluses on top of the existing calluses, and his arms grew stronger from the constant lifting and carrying, his 9-year-old body adapting to demands that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Rex helped by dragging smaller branches, the dog seeming to understand the urgency, working alongside Ethan from dawn until dusk. Food preservation became equally critical, and Ethan threw himself into learning skills that most modern children never needed to know. He set multiple traps simultaneously, checking them twice daily, and when he caught rabbits or squirrels, he cleaned them immediately and cut the meat into thin strips that he hung near the fire on wooden racks he constructed from green willow branches. The meat dried slowly, shriveling and darkening, transforming into jerky that would last months without spoiling. He gathered every edible plant he could find, late-season berries that he spread on flat rocks in the sun to dry, nuts from pine cones that he painstakingly extracted and stored in his woven baskets, roots that he dug up and dried, creating a stockpile that would supplement the meat when fresh food became impossible to find. The cave itself required winterizing, and Ethan approached this task with the same fierce determination. He mixed mud from the stream bank with dried grass, creating a primitive plaster that he packed into every crack and crevice in the cave walls, sealing gaps that would allow precious heat to escape or cold wind to enter. The work was messy and exhausting, his hands constantly caked with mud, his clothes stained beyond recognition, but slowly the cave became more airtight, more insulated, more capable of retaining the warmth from his fire. He created a double-layered door system, building a second barrier inside the first, leaving an air gap between them that would serve as additional insulation. He gathered armloads of dry pine needles and stored them in the third chamber, knowing he would need to constantly refresh his bedding as the damp cold of winter compressed what he had. Rex would be better equipped for the cold than Ethan, his thick German shepherd coat designed by nature for exactly this kind of weather, but Ethan worried constantly about his own ability to survive temperatures he had only experienced from inside warm houses. He fashioned additional clothing from rabbit pelts, curing the skins as best he could with wood ash and water, creating crude mittens and a vest that provided extra layers against the coming freeze. As October arrived and the temperature dropped noticeably each night, Ethan conducted inventory checks with the seriousness of a general preparing for siege. He counted his stores of dried meat, calculating consumption rates. He estimated his firewood supply, trying to determine if it was truly enough. The work was endless and overwhelming, and there were moments when Ethan felt the crushing weight of impossibility, when he wanted to simply give up and surrender. But then he would look at Rex, at the dog's trusting eyes and loyal presence, and he would remember why he was doing this, why survival mattered more than comfort or safety. Winter was coming, relentless and unforgiving, and Ethan would face it because he had no other choice. The morning began like any other, with Ethan stirring the fire back to life and Rex stretching near the entrance. But within minutes, Ethan knew something was wrong. Rex refused his breakfast, a portion of dried rabbit meat that the dog normally devoured with enthusiasm, instead leaving it untouched on the stone floor and moving toward the back of the cave with purposeful strides. Ethan watched, confused, as Rex entered the third chamber and stopped at the far wall, the section farthest from the entrance where the rock face was darkest and least explored. The dog began to whine, a high-pitched sound of distress that Ethan had rarely heard, and then started scratching at the stone with his front paws, his claws scraping against the rock with an insistence that seemed almost frantic. Ethan followed him into the small chamber, kneeling beside the dog and examining the wall where Rex focused all his attention. It looked like any other section of the cave, rough gray stone marked with mineral deposits and the slow water stains of centuries, nothing unusual or remarkable that would explain Rex's behavior. Ethan ran his hands over the surface, feeling for anything different, any crack or hole or irregularity, but found nothing except cold, solid rock. He tried to pull Rex away, gently tugging on the dog's collar and calling him back to the main chamber, but Rex resisted, planting his feet and continuing to scratch and whine with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Throughout the day, Rex returned to that same spot again and again, ignoring Ethan's attempts to distract him with food or play or walks outside the cave. The dog's obsession was complete and unsettling, his normally calm demeanor replaced by an agitation that made Ethan increasingly nervous. He tried everything he could think of to redirect Rex's attention, throwing sticks for him to fetch, offering the choicest pieces of dried meat, even taking him down to the stream for a longer than usual exploration, but the moment they returned to the cave, Rex went straight back to the wall, scratching and whining, sometimes even barking sharply as if trying to communicate something crucial that Ethan was too dense to understand. By evening, Ethan's confusion had turned to frustration and concern. He worried that Rex was sick, that something was wrong with the dog's mind, that maybe the isolation and harsh living conditions were affecting him in ways Ethan couldn't comprehend. He examined Rex thoroughly, checking for injuries or signs of illness, but the dog was physically healthy, his coat glossy, his eyes bright and alert, his body strong and well-fed. The problem wasn't physical. It was something else entirely, something that drove Rex to focus on that particular section of wall with an intensity that defied explanation. Ethan sat in the main chamber that night, watching Rex through the opening to the third room, observing as the dog continued his vigil, occasionally scratching, always whining, never giving up whatever quest had captured his attention. The fire crackled and sent shadows dancing across the cave walls, and Ethan felt a growing unease that had nothing to do with the approaching winter or the challenges of survival. Rex was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate a message that a 9-year-old boy couldn't decipher, and the dog's frustration was as palpable as Ethan's own confusion. His father had always said that dogs possessed senses humans lacked, that they could detect things invisible and inaudible to human perception, and Ethan had learned to trust Rex's instincts about danger and weather and the presence of other animals. But this was different, this obsessive focus on a solid stone wall that held nothing Ethan could see or smell or touch. He resolved that tomorrow he would investigate more thoroughly, would bring better light and examine every inch of that wall, because Rex's behavior meant something, had to mean something, and ignoring it felt like betraying the trust that had kept them both alive through the hardest weeks of Ethan's young life. The next morning, Ethan brought his brightest flashlight to the third chamber, determined to understand what Rex had been trying to tell him for the past 2 days. The dog sat beside him, no longer scratching but watching with an intensity that suggested he knew something important was about to happen. Ethan ran the beam of light slowly across the wall section that had captured Rex's attention, examining it inch by inch, looking for anything he might have missed during his cursory inspection the day before. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the same gray stone he had grown accustomed to seeing everywhere in the cave, but then the angle of the light caught something different, a subtle variation in color and texture that his eyes had previously overlooked. He moved closer, his face inches from the wall, and realized with a jolt of surprise that this section wasn't solid rock at all. It was composed of individual stones, smaller pieces carefully fitted together, deliberately placed to blend with the surrounding cave wall, but unmistakably the work of human hands rather than geological formation. The mortar between them, if there had ever been any, had long since crumbled away, leaving only gravity and careful placement to hold the stones in position. Ethan's heart began to race as he understood the implications. Someone had built this wall, had sealed off something behind it, had gone to considerable effort to make it look natural and undisturbed. He placed his hand flat against the stones and pushed gently, feeling them shift slightly, confirming that they were loose, removable. Rex whined softly beside him, tail wagging now, as if pleased that his young master had finally understood. Ethan began removing the stones one at a time, working carefully from the top, not wanting to cause a collapse that might injure him or destroy whatever lay hidden behind. The first stone came away easily, revealing darkness beyond, and Ethan felt a rush of cold air escape from the opening, air that had been trapped for who knew how long. He set the stone aside and reached for the next one, then the next, working methodically despite his growing excitement and curiosity. Each stone he removed revealed more of the hollow behind, a space perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, carved into the natural rock or perhaps formed by some ancient geological process and later sealed. The work took nearly an hour, his small hands growing tired and scraped, but finally he had removed enough stones to shine his flashlight into the cavity and see what Rex had somehow sensed through solid rock. The beam illuminated a dark shape, and Ethan reached in carefully, his fingers closing around something made of leather, cracked and stiff with age. He pulled it out slowly, reverently, and found himself holding an old satchel, the kind with a flap and a buckle, its leather darkened by time and covered in a fine layer of dust. The buckle was rusted but still functional, and with trembling fingers Ethan opened it, revealing contents that had been protected from moisture and decay by the sealed environment. Papers, a small notebook bound in leather, folded maps, and other items he couldn't immediately identify in the dim light. Rex pressed close, sniffing at the satchel with obvious interest, and Ethan carried it carefully back to the main chamber where the firelight would allow proper examination. He sat cross-legged on his sleeping platform, the mysterious satchel in his lap, and felt a profound sense that his life was about to change again. That whatever secrets this hidden cache contained would somehow alter everything he thought he knew about his cave, his sanctuary, his hidden refuge in the Montana wilderness. The leather satchel sat before Ethan like a treasure chest from another time, its surface cracked and weathered but still intact after what must have been years of hidden storage. He unbuckled the flap with careful fingers, aware that he was opening something that had been deliberately concealed, something important enough that another person had gone to great lengths to hide it in a sealed hollow behind a stone wall. The first item he pulled out was a stack of papers, the edges yellowed and brittle, covered in neat handwriting that spoke of education and careful attention to detail. The pages were filled with notes, observations, and what appeared to be measurements and calculations, technical information that Ethan couldn't fully understand, but recognized as the work of someone methodical and precise. Beneath the loose papers he found maps, topographical surveys of the mountain region surrounding his cave, marked with symbols and annotations in the same careful handwriting, certain areas circled in red ink that had faded to rust brown over time. But it was the journal that captured Ethan's attention most completely, a leather-bound notebook about the size of his hand, its pages filled from front to back with entries written in a tight, controlled script. He opened it carefully to the first page and read the words written there. Field Journal, Arthur Brennan, Environmental Sciences, Montana State Survey, March 2010. 15 years ago. Ethan calculated quickly, when he had been just a baby, when his parents were still young and alive, and the world was completely different. He turned the pages slowly, reading by firelight, absorbing the story that Arthur Brennan had documented in careful detail. The early entries were scientific and detached, describing water samples collected from various streams and tributaries in the area, pH measurements, mineral content analysis, observations about wildlife and plant health. But as Ethan progressed through the journal, the tone changed, becoming more urgent, more concerned. Arthur had discovered something wrong with the water, contamination that shouldn't have been there, heavy metals and chemical compounds that indicated industrial pollution in an area that was supposed to be pristine wilderness. The entries became investigative rather than purely scientific, describing Arthur's efforts to trace the source of the contamination, following the pollution upstream, documenting what he found with the thoroughness of someone who understood that evidence mattered. That proof would be necessary if he wanted anyone to believe him or take action. Ethan found photographs tucked between pages, faded pictures showing streams with discolored water, dead fish floating belly up, and what appeared to be concealed drainage pipes emerging from hillsides where no pipes should exist. Arthur's handwriting became more agitated in the later entries, his normally neat script showing signs of stress and urgency. He wrote about confronting local authorities, about being dismissed and ignored, about discovering that the contamination was being deliberately hidden by powerful interests who had bought silence and cooperation from people who should have been protecting the public. The journal documented names, dates, locations, a meticulous record of environmental crimes being committed on a massive scale. Ethan read about mining operations that were dumping toxic waste directly into underground aquifers, about falsified inspection reports, about threats made against anyone who asked too many questions. The final entries, written in what must have been the last days before Arthur hid his evidence in this cave, spoke of fear and determination in equal measure. Arthur knew he was in danger, knew that the people whose crimes he had documented would do anything to silence him, but he was determined that the truth would survive even if he didn't. The last entry, dated June 2010, sent chills down Ethan's spine. They know where I am. I can hear them searching. This evidence must reach the authorities. If you're reading this, please finish what I started. The page ended there, incomplete, as if Arthur had been interrupted, and Ethan sat in the firelight holding the journal of a man who had probably died trying to protect the very wilderness that now sheltered a runaway boy and his dog. Ethan spent the entire night reading Arthur Brennan's journal, the pages illuminated by firelight that cast dancing shadows across the careful handwriting. And with each entry he understood more clearly what had driven this scientist to hide his evidence in a cave and what had likely cost him his life. Arthur had been methodical in his documentation, creating a chronological record that began with routine water quality surveys in early 2010 and evolved into something far more sinister. The early entries described Arthur's initial confusion when his test results showed elevated levels of arsenic, lead, and other heavy metals in streams that should have been pristine. He had assumed equipment malfunction or contaminated samples, but repeated testing confirmed the disturbing truth. The mountain's water was being systematically poisoned. Arthur's investigation led him upstream, following the contamination to its source. And what he discovered was a deliberate criminal operation orchestrated by Blackwood Mining Corporation. The company had established illegal extraction sites throughout the region, hidden operations that bypassed environmental regulations and dumped toxic waste directly into underground water systems. Arthur documented it all with scientific precision: photographs of concealed mining sites, GPS coordinates of illegal waste dumps, water samples showing dangerous contamination levels, and copied documents he had somehow obtained proving that Blackwood knew exactly what they were doing and had calculated that the profit from illegal operations outweighed the risk of fines if caught. The journal revealed a conspiracy that extended beyond the corporation itself. Arthur had discovered that local officials were being paid to ignore violations, that inspection reports were being falsified, and that anyone who questioned the operations faced intimidation or worse. He wrote about other scientists and journalists who had asked uncomfortable questions and then suddenly left the area or stopped their investigations without explanation. Arthur himself had received threats, anonymous phone calls warning him to drop his research, strange vehicles following him, and finally, a direct confrontation with men who made clear that continuing his work would have consequences. But Arthur hadn't stopped. Instead, he had gone into hiding, using this cave as his base, while he compiled comprehensive evidence that could expose the entire operation. The journal contained names of Blackwood executives, dates of illegal activities, financial records showing payoffs to officials, and detailed maps marking every contaminated site. Arthur had been building a case that would have destroyed Blackwood Mining and sent multiple people to prison, evidence so damaging that the corporation would have done anything to prevent it from reaching authorities. The final entries showed Arthur's growing fear as his pursuers closed in. He wrote about hearing vehicles in the night, about finding his camp disturbed, about the certainty that he was running out of time. The last words he wrote were instructions for whoever found his evidence: contact the EPA, deliver everything to federal authorities, trust no one locally. Then the journal ended abruptly, and Ethan knew with cold certainty what that silence meant. Arthur Brennan had died protecting this evidence, and now, 15 years later, a 9-year-old boy held in his hands the truth that had killed him. The revelation that Arthur Brennan had hidden in this same cave, had perhaps slept in the same chambers where Ethan now lived, created a connection across 15 years that made the boy's skin prickle with a mixture of awe and fear. Arthur's journal entries from his final weeks describe this exact location: the 3 chambers, the natural water collection pool, the concealed entrance that made it ideal for hiding. Arthur had chosen this cave for the same reasons Ethan had, seeking refuge from a world that had become dangerous, though their circumstances were vastly different. Arthur had been a hunted man, not a runaway child, but the cave had offered both of them the same desperate sanctuary. The journal's middle sections contained the evidence Arthur had died protecting, page after page of meticulous documentation that revealed the full scope of Blackwood Mining's criminal operation. He had recorded 37 separate locations where toxic waste was being illegally dumped, each site marked on the maps with GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions. He had documented the names of 12 Blackwood executives involved in authorizing the illegal operations, including the CEO, Marcus Blackwood himself. He had copied internal memos that showed the company knew their actions were poisoning groundwater that supplied drinking water to 3 towns downstream, affecting thousands of people. Arthur had even obtained financial records showing payments made to county officials, inspectors, and local law enforcement, a web of corruption that ensured the illegal mining could continue without interference. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, the kind of documentation that could destroy a corporation and send people to prison for decades. But Arthur had never been able to deliver it to the authorities, and the journal's final entries explained why. His last week of writing showed a man increasingly desperate and afraid. He described hearing vehicles on the mountain roads at night, the sound of men calling to each other in the darkness, and organized search patterns that were systematically covering the area. He wrote about close calls, times when he had to retreat deep into the cave while searchers passed nearby, once so close he could hear their conversations about what they would do when they found him. The entries became shorter, more hurried, as if Arthur was writing in stolen moments between periods of hiding. The second-to-last entry, dated the 18th of June 2010, described seeing 3 trucks arrive at the base of the mountain, carrying what Arthur estimated to be at least a dozen men. He wrote that he had perhaps 1 day, maybe 2, before they found the cave. The final entry, written in handwriting that showed visible stress and haste, sent chills through Ethan's entire body. The 19th of June 2010. They've found me. I can hear them outside, surrounding the area. No escape possible. I've sealed the evidence in the back wall. If anyone reads this, the evidence must reach the authorities. Contact FBI Environmental Crimes Division. Trust no one local. They're all compromised. Tell them Marcus Blackwood ordered it all. Tell them about the people downstream who are drinking poisoned water. Make them pay for what they've done. The entry ended there, the pen trailing off as if Arthur had been interrupted mid-sentence, and Ethan sat holding the journal with trembling hands. Understanding that he was probably the first person to read these words since Arthur Brennan had written them moments before whatever terrible thing had happened to him, the weight of what Ethan held in his hands pressed down on him with a force far heavier than the physical leather and paper. Arthur Brennan had died in this cave, or somewhere near it, silenced by people who valued profit over human life, over the environment, over basic decency and law. The journal's abrupt ending, the desperate final words, the 15 years of silence that followed all pointed to one terrible conclusion. Arthur had been murdered, his evidence buried with him, his truth erased so completely that no one had ever known to search for it. Ethan felt sick thinking about what Arthur's last moments must have been like, trapped in this cave with killers closing in, knowing that all his work, all his courage, would die with him. But Arthur had managed one final act of defiance by hiding the evidence so thoroughly that even his murderers hadn't found it, sealing it behind stone in the desperate hope that someday, somehow, someone would discover it and finish what he had started. That morning, Ethan made his way down to the stream and noticed something he had somehow overlooked during all his weeks of survival: a faded sign nailed to a tree about half a mile from his cave, its paint weathered but still readable, bearing the Blackwood Mining Corporation logo and claiming mineral rights to the surrounding area. He had passed this sign dozens of times without really seeing it, without understanding its significance, but now it felt like a warning, a claim of ownership over the very land where he had sought refuge. When he ventured slightly farther along an old logging road, he found more evidence of Blackwood's continued presence: tire tracks that were relatively fresh, survey markers with the company name, and in the distance, the faint sound of machinery that suggested active operations. Blackwood Mining hadn't disappeared after Arthur's death. They were still here, still operating, and if Arthur's evidence was accurate, still dumping toxic waste into the mountain's water system. Ethan thought about the stream where he collected his drinking water, about the fish he and Rex ate, about the plants he foraged. Was it all contaminated? Had he been slowly poisoning himself without knowing it? The thought terrified him, but even worse was the realization that if Blackwood was still operating illegally, then people in the towns downstream were still drinking poisoned water, still being harmed by contamination that should have been stopped 15 years ago. Arthur's death had accomplished nothing except buying Blackwood 15 more years of criminal activity, 15 more years of profit built on human suffering and environmental destruction. Ethan returned to the cave and spread out all of Arthur's evidence: the journal, the maps, the photographs, the copied documents. This was proof of ongoing crimes, evidence that could still matter, that could still make a difference if it reached the right people. But Ethan was 9 years old, alone, hiding from authorities who would separate him from Rex and send him to foster care. Bringing this evidence to light would mean revealing himself, exposing his location, surrendering the life he had built in this cave. He faced an impossible choice: protect himself and Rex while allowing Blackwood's crimes to continue, or sacrifice his freedom to finish Arthur Brennan's mission and potentially save countless lives downstream. The moral weight of Arthur Brennan's evidence became a constant presence in Ethan's mind, as heavy and inescapable as the stone walls of his cave. He tried to focus on his daily survival tasks, on gathering firewood and checking his traps and preparing for the rapidly approaching winter, but every action felt hollow and meaningless when measured against the knowledge he now possessed. People were being poisoned, children were drinking contaminated water, families were getting sick, and he alone held the proof that could stop it, evidence that had cost Arthur Brennan his life and had remained hidden for 15 years, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. But bravery had consequences that terrified Ethan more than cold or hunger or any physical danger he had faced in the wilderness. Revealing the evidence meant revealing himself, walking down the mountain and into the arms of the very system he had fled, the social workers and foster homes and rules that would rip him away from Rex without hesitation or mercy. He imagined the scenario playing out, showing Arthur's journal to authorities, being questioned and processed. Rex being taken to an animal shelter while Ethan was placed with strangers who might be kind or might be cruel, but who certainly wouldn't understand why a boy and his dog needed to stay together. The thought of Rex's confusion and fear, of the dog waiting for Ethan to come back and rescue him, of that loyal, brown-eyed gaze slowly losing hope as days turned to weeks and Ethan never appeared, was more than he could bear. He had risked everything to keep them together, had survived impossible odds, had built a life from nothing in this hidden cave, and now fate was asking him to surrender it all for people he didn't know, for an abstract concept of justice that felt impossibly distant from his own desperate reality. Ethan spent hours sitting at the cave entrance with Rex beside him, wrestling with the decision, trying to find some third option that would allow him to do the right thing without destroying his own life. Could he somehow get the evidence to authorities anonymously? He considered leaving the satchel somewhere it would be found, but who would believe 15-year-old documents discovered randomly? The evidence needed context, needed Arthur's story to be told, needed someone to explain its significance and demand action. Could he wait until he was older, until he aged out of foster care, and could make his own decisions? But that was years away, and in the meantime, how many more people would drink poisoned water? How many more children would develop illnesses from the contamination Blackwood was causing? Arthur had died trying to stop these crimes, and Ethan couldn't ignore that sacrifice by choosing his own comfort over the lives of strangers who deserved clean water and environmental protection. His father's voice came to him from memory, words spoken during a camping trip that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, Ethan. Sometimes it costs us something. Sometimes it costs us a lot. But that's what separates people who just survive from people who actually live with honor. His father had been talking about returning a lost wallet they had found on a trail, a simple lesson in honesty. But the principle felt crushingly relevant now. Ethan looked down at Rex, at the dog who had never questioned their flight into the wilderness, who had trusted completely in his young master's decisions, who had helped him survive through loyalty and companionship that asked nothing in return except to stay together. How could he betray that trust? But then he thought about Arthur Brennan, about a man who had given his life trying to protect people he didn't know, about courage that went beyond self-interest, about the kind of person his father had tried to teach him to be. The struggle consumed Ethan for days, stealing his sleep and haunting his waking hours, and he found no easy answer because there was no easy answer. Only two impossible choices that each demanded a sacrifice he wasn't sure he could make. The first sign of danger came on a cold October night when Ethan woke to sounds that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. Rex was already awake, standing rigid near the cave entrance, his ears forward and his body tense in a way that Ethan had learned meant serious threat. The sounds were distant but unmistakable. Engines, multiple vehicles moving slowly along the mountain roads, stopping and starting as if searching methodically through the wilderness. Ethan held his breath and listened, his hand resting on Rex's back, feeling the vibration of a low growl building in the dog's throat. The vehicles eventually moved on, their sounds fading into the distance, but sleep wouldn't return that night, and Ethan lay awake until dawn, wondering if the sounds were coincidence or something far more sinister. The next morning he found the boot prints near the stream, fresh impressions in the soft mud at the water's edge where he filled his bottles every day. They were large, adult-sized, with the deep tread pattern of hiking or work boots, and they were recent, probably made within the last day. Ethan's heart hammered as he studied them, following the trail of prints along the stream bank, noting how they moved in a grid pattern, systematic and deliberate. The kind of search technique someone would use if they were looking for something specific. The prints led away from his cave, thankfully, but their mere existence shattered his illusion of safety and isolation. Someone was in his area, someone was searching, and Ethan couldn't convince himself it was just random hikers when combined with the vehicle sounds from the night before. Over the following days, more signs appeared that made Ethan's anxiety grow into genuine fear. Rex became increasingly agitated, growling at shadows and sounds that Ethan couldn't perceive, the dog's superior senses detecting threats before they became visible. Ethan found more boot prints in different locations, always the same distinctive tread pattern, always moving in patterns that suggested organized searching rather than casual exploration. Once, while gathering firewood, he heard voices in the distance, men calling to each other in tones that sounded professional and coordinated. He and Rex hid behind a fallen log until the voices faded, and when Ethan finally dared to investigate, he found cigarette butts and tire tracks where vehicles had parked just half a mile from his cave. The realization hit him with cold clarity. Someone knew about this area. Someone was actively searching these mountains, and whether they were looking for him specifically or for something else entirely, their presence meant his sanctuary was compromised. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too terrible. He had found Arthur Brennan's evidence, had spent days agonizing over what to do with it, and now suddenly there were searchers in the area for the first time since he had arrived. Had someone somehow known he found the evidence? Was Blackwood Mining still monitoring this area after 15 years? Or was this connected to his own disappearance, authorities finally expanding their search this far into the wilderness? Either way, Ethan understood that his time was running out, that the choice he had been struggling with was being made for him by circumstances beyond his control, and that very soon, he and Rex would have to either run deeper into the mountains or face whatever was coming for them. The man appeared at midday when the sun was high, and Ethan had foolishly allowed himself to believe the morning's quiet meant safety. Rex gave the alert, a sharp bark that sent Ethan's heart into his throat, and they both saw him at the same moment. A tall figure in khaki outdoor gear moving purposefully up the slope toward the cave entrance. Ethan's first instinct was pure panic, grabbing his backpack and Rex's collar, retreating into the second chamber and then the third, pressing themselves against the far wall where the darkness was deepest. His mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, desperate plans, but there was no back exit from the cave, no way out except through the entrance where the stranger now stood. The man's voice called out, echoing off the stone walls, friendly and casual in a way that somehow made it more threatening. "Hello? Anyone in there? I'm Ranger Daniels with the Forest Service. Just doing a routine patrol of the area." The words should have been reassuring, but Rex's continued growling told Ethan what his own instincts suspected. Something was wrong. Ethan peered carefully around the corner of the chamber entrance, his eyes adjusting to see the silhouette of the man framed against the daylight. The stranger had pulled out a flashlight and was shining it into the cave, the beam sweeping across the main chamber, illuminating Ethan's fire pit, his storage areas, the obvious signs of habitation. The man stepped inside, his boots crunching on the stone floor, and that's when Ethan saw it, the logo on the back of his jacket, visible for just a moment as he turned. Not the official Forest Service emblem, but the distinctive mountain and pickaxe symbol of Blackwood Mining Corporation. The lie was so blatant, so obvious once noticed, that Ethan felt a chill run through his entire body. This wasn't a ranger conducting routine patrols. This was someone from Blackwood, searching for something, and Ethan knew with terrible certainty what that something must be: Arthur's evidence. Somehow, they knew, or suspected, or had never stopped watching this cave after they killed Arthur 15 years ago. The man moved deeper into the cave, his flashlight probing the shadows. "I can see someone's been living here. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just want to talk. Maybe you need help?" His voice was calm, practiced, the tone of someone trained to sound trustworthy, but every word felt like a trap. Ethan held Rex tight, one hand over the dog's muzzle to keep him quiet, barely daring to breathe. The man was perhaps 20 feet away now, close enough that one more chamber would bring them face to face. Ethan's mind scrambled for options. Could he and Rex rush past the man and escape? Could they hide well enough that a thorough search wouldn't find them? Could he fight, a 9-year-old boy against a grown man? None of the options were good. All of them ended badly, and Ethan realized with crushing despair that his hidden life, his carefully built sanctuary, his desperate attempt to stay free and keep Rex, was about to end in the worst possible way. Not captured by well-meaning social workers, but by men from a corporation that had already killed once to protect their secrets and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. The sound of additional voices outside the cave made Ethan's blood run cold. The fake ranger called out, "Over here," found the cave. And within moments 3 more men appeared at the entrance, all wearing the same outdoor gear, all carrying the same professional equipment that marked them as something far more organized than casual hikers. Ethan watched from his hiding place in the 3rd chamber as the men gathered in the main cave area, their flashlights sweeping across every surface, examining his fire pit, his storage baskets, his carefully constructed sleeping platform. One of them, a stocky man with a gray beard, seemed to be in charge. "Someone's definitely living here. Kid, probably, based on the size of that bed." Another man responded. "The smoke reports were right. Been seeing it for weeks now," finally pinpointed the location. Ethan's heart sank as he understood. His fires, his careful survival, his daily routines had betrayed him. Someone hiking or hunting in the area had spotted smoke, had reported it, and Blackwood had been searching systematically until they found the source. The gray-bearded man continued, "We need to search every inch of this cave. If the evidence is here, we find it. If there's a kid hiding, we need to secure the situation quietly. No complications, understand?" The words confirmed Ethan's worst fears. They were looking for Arthur's evidence, and they had no intention of letting anyone who might have found it simply walk away. These weren't men who would call social services if they found a runaway boy. These were men who protected Blackwood's secrets by any means necessary, just as they had 15 years ago when Arthur Brennan had threatened to expose them. Ethan pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the smallest chamber, Rex trembling beside him, both of them trapped with no escape route. The cave that had been their sanctuary was now their prison. 4 men stood between them and the only exit, and those men were methodically beginning to search deeper into the cave system, their flashlights growing brighter as they approached the 2nd chamber. Ethan's hand found Arthur's leather satchel in his backpack, the evidence that had cost one man his life, and was now threatening to cost a boy and his dog everything they had fought so desperately to preserve. Rex made the decision before Ethan could stop him, the dog's protective instincts overriding any sense of self-preservation. With a bark that echoed like thunder through the cave chambers, Rex launched himself toward the men, 80 pounds of muscle and fury erupting from the darkness. The men shouted in surprise and alarm as the German Shepherd charged into the main chamber, barking ferociously, his teeth bared, every bit the trained guard dog his breeding had designed him to be. The distraction was immediate and complete, all 4 men scrambling backward, one pulling out what looked like a weapon, their flashlights swinging wildly as they tried to track the attacking dog. In that moment of chaos, Ethan moved. Weeks ago, during his explorations of the cave system, he had discovered a narrow crack in the wall of the 2nd chamber, a gap barely wide enough for his small body that led to a tight passage angling upward through the rock. He had explored it once out of curiosity, finding that it eventually opened onto the mountainside about 50 yards from the main entrance, hidden behind thick brush. Now that forgotten discovery became his salvation. He grabbed his backpack with Arthur's satchel inside and squeezed into the narrow passage, the rough stone scraping his shoulders and arms as he pushed through. Behind him he could hear Rex's continued barking, the men's shouted commands, chaos that his brave dog was creating to buy him time. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he crawled through the darkness, knowing he was leaving Rex behind, abandoning his loyal companion to save himself and the evidence. The passage seemed endless, his body barely fitting through sections where the rock pressed in from all sides, panic threatening to overwhelm him as he struggled forward inch by agonizing inch. Finally, he saw light ahead, a gray opening partially obscured by vegetation, and he pushed through with desperate strength, emerging onto the mountainside, gasping and scraped and terrified. Behind him, muffled by stone and distance, he could still hear barking and shouting from the cave. Ethan wanted to go back, wanted to rescue Rex, but he knew that would mean capture and the loss of everything Arthur had died protecting. His dog had given him a chance, had sacrificed himself so Ethan could escape, and honoring that sacrifice meant running, meant getting the evidence to safety no matter the cost. Ethan clutched the backpack to his chest and ran, crashing through the forest with none of his usual caution, putting distance between himself and the cave as quickly as his legs could carry him. Branches whipped his face and tore at his clothes, his breath coming in ragged sobs, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop, driven by fear and grief and desperate purpose. He ran until his legs gave out, and he collapsed behind a fallen log, his entire body shaking. The forest around him was quiet, no sounds of pursuit yet, but he knew they would come. They had found his cave, they had Rex, and they would search for him with the same systematic determination they had used to find Arthur Brennan 15 years ago. But this time would be different because this time the evidence wouldn't die in a cave. Ethan pulled out Arthur's journal and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of responsibility that now rested entirely on his 9-year-old shoulders, and he made a promise to both Arthur and Rex that their sacrifices would not be in vain. Ethan ran like he had never run before, his small legs pumping with adrenaline-fueled desperation. Arthur's satchel clutched so tightly against his chest that the leather dug into his arms. Behind him, he could hear the men crashing through the underbrush, their shouts coordinating the pursuit, and he knew with sickening certainty that despite his knowledge of the terrain, despite every advantage his size and familiarity should give him, they were faster and stronger and gaining ground. He used every trick his father had taught him, zigzagging through dense thickets where larger bodies would struggle, sliding down steep embankments that forced his pursuers to find alternate routes. But each clever maneuver bought him only seconds, and seconds weren't enough when the men behind him had longer strides and adult endurance. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, and tears blurred his vision as he thought about Rex, about his brave dog facing those men alone, about everything he was losing in this desperate flight. The forest seemed endless, every tree looking like the last, every ridge offering false hope of escape, and Ethan felt his strength failing, his body approaching the absolute limit of what it could endure. Then, through a gap in the trees ahead, he saw it, a small wooden structure with a green roof and a radio antenna, the unmistakable architecture of a Forest Service ranger station. Hope exploded in his chest, giving him a final burst of speed he didn't know he possessed. He burst from the tree line and sprinted across the clearing, his feet pounding on packed earth, the men's shouts louder now, closer, so close he imagined he could feel their breath on his neck. He hit the station's door with his shoulder, not bothering to slow down or knock, the impact throwing it open as he stumbled inside, nearly falling, his momentum carrying him into the center of a small office where a woman in an actual Forest Service uniform looked up from her desk in shock. The ranger, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and short gray hair, took in the scene instantly, a filthy, terrified 9-year-old boy, scratched and bleeding, clutching a leather satchel, gasping for breath, and behind him, through the still open door, the sound of men running. Her training kicked in immediately, her expression shifting from surprise to protective alertness in a heartbeat. She stood and moved between Ethan and the door, one hand reaching for the radio on her belt. "What's happening? Who's chasing you?" Ethan tried to speak but couldn't get enough air, his words coming out in gasping fragments. "Men, Blackwood Mining, they killed someone. Evidence, please help." The ranger's eyes narrowed at the mention of Blackwood, and she pressed the button on her radio with decisive authority. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Station 7. I need immediate backup, possible child endangerment situation, multiple adult males pursuing a minor. Send county sheriff and state police." The door burst open and 2 of the men appeared, breathing hard, their faces flushed from exertion. They stopped short when they saw the ranger, their expressions shifting to forced casualness that didn't match their aggressive pursuit. The gray-bearded man spoke first, his voice smooth, despite his heavy breathing. "Thank God you found him, Ranger. This boy ran away from his group. We've been searching for hours." The Ranger's hand stayed on her radio, her body language protective as she kept herself between the men and Ethan. "Really? Because he seems terrified of you. And in my experience, kids don't run that hard from people trying to help them. You can wait outside until backup arrives and we sort this out properly." The men exchanged glances, calculating, and Ethan saw the moment they realized their situation had changed, that whatever they had planned to do in the isolated forest couldn't happen here. Not with a federal ranger as witness and backup already called. The state police arrived within 20 minutes, 3 vehicles converging on the ranger station with lights flashing, transforming the quiet clearing into a scene of official authority that made the Blackwood men's faces go pale. Ethan sat in the ranger's office wrapped in a blanket someone had provided, his hands still trembling, watching through the window as officers questioned the men outside and eventually placed them in handcuffs. A detective named Sarah Chen entered the office, her expression serious but not unkind, and she pulled up a chair to sit at Ethan's level, rather than towering over him. She introduced herself, explained that he was safe now, and asked him gently if he could tell her what had happened. Ethan's story came out in a torrent, weeks of isolation and fear and loneliness breaking open like a dam, and he told her everything. His parents' death, running away to keep Rex, surviving in the cave, finding Arthur Brennan's hidden evidence, the men who came searching, Rex's sacrifice to help him escape. His voice broke when he talked about his dog, about leaving Rex behind, and Detective Chen's hand rested briefly on his shoulder in silent comfort before she asked to see the evidence he had mentioned. Ethan pulled Arthur's leather satchel from his backpack and placed it on the desk, his hands reverent despite their trembling. Detective Chen opened it carefully, her expression shifting from professional interest to intense focus as she examined the contents, the journal, the maps, the photographs, the copied documents that Arthur Brennan had compiled 15 years ago. She read portions of the journal, her face growing darker with each page, and then she made a phone call that brought more officials, environmental protection agents and FBI personnel who arrived as the afternoon wore into evening. The ranger station became a command center as specialists examined Arthur's evidence, cross-referencing his documentation with current records, making calls to labs and oversight agencies. Ethan watched it all from his corner, exhausted beyond measure but unable to rest, needing to see this through, needing to know that Arthur's death and Rex's sacrifice had meant something. An FBI agent named Morrison, a tall man with gray hair and a gentle voice, sat with Ethan and explained what they were finding. Arthur Brennan's evidence was not only valid but devastating. The illegal dumping sites he had documented 15 years ago were still active, still poisoning the water supply that served thousands of people downstream. The names Arthur had recorded matched current Blackwood mining executives and local officials who were still in power, still being paid to look the other way. The financial records provided a paper trail that forensic accountants could follow directly to the corporation's highest levels. Morrison told Ethan that what he had found and protected would likely result in criminal charges against dozens of people, the shutdown of Blackwood's illegal operations, massive environmental cleanup efforts, and justice for communities that had been unknowingly poisoned for nearly 2 decades. He told Ethan that he was extraordinarily brave, that Arthur Brennan would be proud, that sometimes the most important acts of courage come from the most unlikely heroes. As night fell, Detective Chen brought Ethan food and asked about his immediate situation, about family or guardians who should be contacted. Ethan's heart sank as he explained about social services, about foster care, about how he had run away to keep Rex, and he waited for the inevitable response that he would be taken into custody, processed back into the system he had fled. But Chen surprised him by saying they would take things one step at a time, that his welfare was important but so was recognizing what he had accomplished, and that sometimes extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary solutions. She made a call to her supervisor, explaining the unique situation, advocating for consideration of Ethan's wishes and circumstances, her voice firm with conviction that this child deserved more than bureaucratic processing after everything he had survived and sacrificed. Through the window, Ethan could see the Blackwood men sitting in separate police vehicles, their confident aggression from the forest replaced by the defeated posture of people who knew their crimes had finally caught up with them. He thought about Arthur Brennan, about a man who had died alone trying to protect people he would never meet, and he hoped somehow that Arthur knew his evidence had finally reached the light, that his death had not been meaningless, that justice, though delayed 15 years, was finally coming. The following days passed in a blur of interviews, medical examinations, and meetings with officials who treated Ethan not as a runaway to be punished, but as a hero whose courage had exposed crimes that affected thousands of lives. His story spread through news outlets, the tale of a 9-year-old boy who survived alone in the wilderness and discovered evidence of environmental crimes that authorities had missed for 15 years, capturing public attention and sympathy in ways that changed everything about his situation. Social services did arrive, but the caseworker who came was different from Miss Patterson, a younger woman named Maria Santos who had followed Ethan's story and approached him with respect rather than bureaucratic detachment. She explained that his circumstances were unique, that his case had drawn attention from people who wanted to help rather than simply process him through the system. What happened next felt like a miracle Ethan had stopped believing in. A woman named Helen Reese contacted social services from Seattle, explaining that she was Ethan's maternal aunt, his mother's younger sister who had been estranged from the family for years over some long-forgotten argument, but who had seen the news coverage and immediately understood that her nephew needed family. She drove through the night to reach Montana, a slim woman in her late 30s with kind eyes that reminded Ethan achingly of his mother, and when she met him at the ranger station where he had been temporarily staying, she didn't ask about rules or procedures or logistics. She asked if he was okay, if he needed anything, and most importantly, she asked about Rex. The reunion with Rex came 3 days after Ethan's escape from the cave, 3 days that felt like an eternity of not knowing if his dog was safe or hurt or worse. The Blackwood men had released Rex when they fled the cave after realizing their operation was compromised, and the German Shepherd had been found by hikers and taken to a local veterinary clinic where he waited, confused but unharmed. When they brought Rex into the room where Ethan sat with his Aunt Helen, the dog's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, launching himself at his young master with such force that they both tumbled to the floor. Rex licking Ethan's face and whining with joy while Ethan wrapped his arms around the dog's neck and cried into his thick fur, all the fear and grief and loneliness of their separation pouring out in great heaving sobs. Helen watched the reunion with tears in her own eyes, and when Ethan finally looked up at her, afraid to hope, she smiled and said simply, "Of course he's coming home with us. I have a house with a big yard and I've always wanted a dog." The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed. Helen's custody petition supported by character witnesses, psychological evaluations that showed Ethan's fundamental stability despite his trauma, and public sentiment that recognized the unique bond between boy and dog. A judge granted temporary guardianship within 2 weeks, with adoption proceedings to follow, and suddenly Ethan had a future that included both family and Rex, the two things he had believed he could never have together. Before they left Montana, Helen drove Ethan back to the mountain one final time so he could say goodbye to the cave that had been his home. They hiked up the familiar trail, Rex bounding ahead with his usual enthusiasm, and when they reached the hidden entrance partially concealed by brush and fallen rocks, Ethan stood for a long moment just looking. The cave appeared smaller somehow, less imposing than it had seemed during the desperate weeks when it represented his entire world. His improvements were still visible, the woven door, the fire pit, the sleeping platform, all the small touches that had transformed bare stone into livable space. Helen stayed back, giving him privacy, and Ethan stepped inside one last time, his eyes adjusting to the familiar dimness, his hands touching the cool walls that had sheltered him through the hardest period of his young life. He thought about all the hours spent here, about the fear and determination and gradual transformation from terrified runaway to capable survivor. He thought about Arthur Brennan, about another person who had hidden in these same chambers fighting for what was right, and he hoped that somehow Arthur knew his evidence had finally made a difference. Ethan emerged from the cave and called Rex to his side, one hand resting on the dog's head as he took a final look at the mountain landscape that had nearly killed him and had ultimately saved him. They walked back down the trail together, boy and dog and the aunt who had given them both a second chance, leaving behind the cave but carrying forward everything it had taught about courage and survival, and the unbreakable bonds forged in adversity. As Helen's car pulled away from the trailhead and began the long drive toward Seattle and their new life, Ethan looked back through the rear window at the mountains receding into the distance. The cave was invisible from here, hidden as it had always been, But Ethan knew exactly where it was, could feel its presence like a permanent marker on the map of his life. He would never forget what he and Rex had survived together in that stone sanctuary. Never forget the boy he had been when he ran into those mountains, and the person he had become through necessity and determination. Rex sat beside him in the back seat, the dog's head resting on Ethan's lap, and as they drove toward whatever future waited in Seattle, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced since before his parents died. Hope, real and solid and sustainable, the knowledge that he was finally heading somewhere he belonged.